While the Nintendo 64 was in its prime in 1997, Wei Yan, who had worked with Silicon Graphics to develop the graphical technology used for the N64, formed a new tech company called ArtX. And in 1998, they were given a task by Nintendo once again to create a new graphics processor for their upcoming successor. Their intention was to make it the king of the hill 128-bit juggernaut of gaming systems, with Howard Lincoln stating that Dr. Yan had the best people working on it. The console was also designed with a simpler RSIC, which made it easier for third-party developers to make games for it. Seems kind of ironic considering how much third-party developers loathed Nintendo's lock chip policies back in the 8 and 16-bit era. On May 1999, Nintendo announced Project Dolphin as a successor to the N64. The project name is based on the processor made by ArtX called the Flipper, which would also carry on into some of Nintendo's exclusives like Super Mario Sunshine. Just as the processor was nearing completion, in 2000, ArtX was purchased by ATI. You may recognize their logo on the system. Despite the acquisition, the team was still able to finish the processor as planned, and that same year, the GameCube was announced by Nintendo. The next year, launch titles were listed including Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader and Luigi's Mansion. It's about time Luigi got his own proper game. Mario is Missing doesn't count. The Nintendo GameCube was released on September 2001 in Japan, November in North America, and the rest of the world by May 2002, and in true Nintendo tradition, its launch price was $399, much less than its rivals. This is one of the most basic yet unique looking consoles I've ever seen. The title of this thing speaks for itself, the Nintendo GameCube. Like any Nintendo system between the mid-90s to mid-2000s, it had a rainbow of colors to choose from like orange, silver, black, and indigo as you see here. I'm honestly not a big fan of the design. It looks like an oversized lunchbox, and is possibly one of the reasons why it didn't sell as well as it should have, which we'll get to. While the handle is handy, no pun intended, holding a decade-old console in public would be pretty embarrassing. You know what they should have done? Make it look more like a dolphin, and it requires water to power it. Sorry, I'm just trying to find ways that can make the console stay true to the code name. You have the power at the back and AV output here, which also has an optional digital slot for progressive output. Down the bottom are outputs for a modem to allow broadband connection, and the Game Boy Player, which I touched on in my Game Boy Advance review. Highly recommended if you can find it cheap. Don't forget, it needs the disc to run it. Speaking of the Game Boy Advance, some games like Metroid Prime Fusion and Pokemon Ruby Sapphire took advantage of the GameCube Game Boy Advance link cable. After sticking with cartridges for the Nintendo 64 failed from a financial perspective, Nintendo finally made the switch to discs. But it didn't matter that much because they were still paranoid about piracy. Nintendo called Panasonic to make special mini DVDs that held about 1.5 gigabytes. Far below the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, as their games used normal sized dual layer DVDs that held around 8.5 gigabytes. They are literally the size of my hand if I had no fingers, and some games like Metal Gear Solid the Twin Snake and Resident Evil 4 require 2 discs. Despite games being compressed and omitting a few features, graphically it was pretty close to its rivals. But don't expect the GameCube library to be filled with system-pushing powerhouses like Grand Theft Auto or Half-Life 2. I really don't understand why Dr. Yan's team at ArtX went above and beyond to make the Dolphin's graphical capabilities more powerful than its rivals, because the disc size means it can't work to its full potential. But then again, the Nintendo 64 only used cartridges while the PlayStation used CDs, and today the N64 games have aged more gracefully. I'm not what you call a tech guru. Speaking of the Nintendo 64, the controller is not brilliant, to be honest. It was innovative with its analog stick and rumble pack, but it's so awkward to use simply because you can't reach all the buttons unless you swap handles. It honestly wouldn't have surprised me if this wasn't designed by a human. The HorrorPad Mini 64 fixes all those problems. And to say the GameCube controller improves from its predecessor is putting it lightly. Of all the controllers I've used in my lifetime, this one is my favourite. It's over a decade old, with no dead spot on either analog stick. It's comfortable, every button can be reached during gameplay without swapping handles, and is as reliable as a wood-burning stove. Words don't do justice on how amazing this controller is. Trust me, it's worth paying for the real deal over aftermarket. This is made for Nintendo exclusives. Like trying to play Sims busting out with this thing, I'll stick with a keyboard and mouse. But games like Super Smash Bros. Melee and Metroid Prime, yes, I approve. But Nintendo weren't done. When Super Smash Bros. Wii U came out in 2014, the demand for a GameCube controller increased again, right to the point that Nintendo released an adapter that allowed you to plug GameCube controllers into the Wii U, and re-released the controller itself with a silver Super Smash Bros. Logo and a longer wire, which is why it's the one I regularly use, and because it's the newest. The GameCube has 2 memory cards and 4 controller inputs. Like the Nintendo 64, one of its biggest strengths was co-op multiplayer. After a couple of races and duels in Mario Kart Double Dash for example, you and your friends are hooked. However, online activity was minimal at best and currently obsolete. The only game the aforementioned modem allowed for internet gaming was Phantasy Star Online. The rest were LAN, and only a few games took advantage of it. Nintendo President Satoru Iwata said in 2004 that most customers do not wish to pay the extra money for connection to the internet, and for some customers, connection procedures to the internet are still not easy. Maybe Nintendo gamers in general weren't keen on online gaming at the time, and the internet was very different compared to what it is now, but I would have liked for him to say that quote to Bill Gates. The GameCube was also the first Nintendo console not to have a Super Mario game as a launch title, with Super Mario Sunshine being released a year after launch, and the last to have an exclusive developed by Rare with Star Fox Adventures. It was released on September 23, 2002. Then, on September 24, the company was purchased by Microsoft, a date which will live in infamy. Rare were also developing a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing called Donkey Kong Racing. It was even on bits of GameCube promotional material, but the Microsoft acquisition threw a wrench into those plans. Fortunately, Nintendo had a new exclusive developer who were just as capable with Nintendo IPs. Step right up, Retro Studios, who revived the Metroid series in a vast way with Prime, one of the greatest video games ever made. Nintendo continued to rely on their mascots with Mario Kart Double Dash, Super Smash Bros. Melee, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Luigi's Mansion, Animal Crossing, Pikmin, F-Zero GX, The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess. Third-party support was much stronger, with a grand total of 661 games officially released, in comparison to the Nintendo 64 with 388 games, as well as releasing third-party exclusives including Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes, Resident Evil 4, and Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader. Anyone can agree that the GameCube spawned a lot of incredibly solid titles, so why was it third place in the console wars? Well, I have 2 theories. Nintendo were trying harder to target an adult audience with a new Capcom deal to make Resident Evil exclusive to Nintendo, and their own IP, Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem. But because the GameCube looks more like a kid's toy compared to the Xbox and PlayStation 2, add to Nintendo's piracy paranoia, which meant less space for developers to work with, and you have a gaming system that doesn't know what it wants to be. Let's look at it again. It's a purple cube that uses tiny discs, requires an unusual controller to play, and some of the games like Zelda Wind Waker, in which the trailer promised a darker Zelda title, use cel-shaded effects. All of these were red flags signaling that the GameCube was a game console just for kids. This doesn't look like a system that would have a brief exclusive title in which Leon S. Kennedy could have his head cut off with a chainsaw. Speaking of less disk space, the one surefire thing that really hurt sales the same way it killed the Sega Dreamcast was the lack of a DVD player. Or maybe A Clockwork Orange is too inappropriate for a Nintendo system to take. DVDs exploded in popularity during the early 2000s, and the PS2 and Xbox were able to work as DVD players, becoming more than just gaming systems as opposed to the GameCube. Did I mention it came out a few days after the Xbox in North America? It was hard for Nintendo because they were solely a gaming company, and while the portable market was kind to them, they were going up against Sony and Microsoft, electronic companies that made lots of money from other divisions, which they used to muscle their way into the gaming industry, and if they made a loss, it wouldn't hurt them long term the same way it would for Nintendo. The PlayStation 2 was another runaway train in terms of units sold with 155 million. Microsoft established themselves in the gaming market with the Xbox selling around 24 million, and Nintendo were fairly successful as well, selling close to 22 million GameCubes after discontinuing in 2007. But being in third place, Nintendo knew they had to change the direction they were going in. Even Hiroshi Yamauchi stepped down as president and was replaced by Satoru Iwata, who would briefly change their fortunes with the Nintendo DS and Wii. If you're looking to experience the GameCube library with the Wii because it's backwards compatible and cheaper, remember, you can't attach a Game Boy player to it, and not every system is backwards compatible, so remember to check before you buy. You should be fine. There are probably more Wiis backwards compatible with GameCube games than GameCubes. Point being, it's hard to associate the word Nintendo with underrated, but that's exactly what it is. All the games I mentioned before are worth buying a GameCube for, but because Nintendo didn't sell that many, good luck trying to find them cheap. And I sincerely mean that, a GameCube is worth having in your collection.